Let's see how well you can guess as the Great War bled the world dry. The Ottoman Empire, once the seat of sultans, the bridge between continents, and the keeper of centuries, stood broken and gasping for air. Its armies shattered, its lands occupied, its spirit crushed beneath the boots of foreign powers. The empire that had ruled for over 600 years now waited for its final breath. In the cold aftermath of surrender, British and French ships filled the Bosporus. Their flags flew over Constantinople, and with them came humiliation, the kind that seeps into a nation's bones. The once mighty empire was to be divided, its lands parceled out like spoils of war. The world believed Turkey was finished, but from the ashes of defeat in the far reaches of Anatolia, a spark caught flame. Among the disillusioned officers and the defiant peasants, a single idea began to take shape: freedom. It would not come easily. The road ahead would be carved through betrayal, blood, and impossible odds. And at its center stood one man, Mustafa Kemal Pasha, soldier, strategist, and soon the father of a new nation. This is the story of how the people of a fallen empire defied the powers of the world, how they rose from the ruins of humiliation to forge the Republic of Turkey, a story of endurance, revolution, and rebirth. This is the Turkish War of Independence. This is Erahive, where history speaks, the empire's final breath. As the Central Powers saw their hopes of victory fading into the smoke of the Great War, the Ottoman Empire, the sick man of Europe, began to crumble under the weight of its own exhaustion. Once stretching from the deserts of Arabia to the gates of Vienna, the empire now found itself surrounded, broken, and bleeding. In October 1918, Grand Vizier Talayat Pasha, one of the last architects of Ottoman power, resigned. He believed his presence was an obstacle to peace, a shadow over any chance of mercy from the victorious allies. His departure opened the door for the inevitable, the Armistice of Mudros, signed on October 30th, 1918. The terms were devastating. Ottoman armies were to be disbanded, their weapons surrendered, their fortresses occupied. The Allies claimed the right to seize any territory in case of disorder. In truth, this clause meant they could take whatever they pleased, whenever they wished. The following weeks would bring humiliation. British, French, Italian, and Greek ships sailed through the Dardanelles, their flags glinting in the winter sun as they entered Constantinople. The city that had once been the jewel of two empires now watched 50,000 foreign troops march through its streets. The claim was protection, the reality, occupation. Across the empire, despair turned to anger. Ottoman officers ordered to disarm quietly refused. Villagers watching foreign soldiers seize their towns began whispering of resistance. And in the corridors of power, the Sultan Mehmed VI Vahideddin searched desperately for stability, unaware that his throne now rested on crumbling stone. The once unified realm began to fracture. The Committee of Union and Progress, the ruling party that had dominated the empire through the war, dissolved. Its leaders fled into exile, leaving behind chaos and betrayal. But amid this collapse, something deeper stirred. From the ashes of an empire, a question began to echo through Anatolia. If the Sultan would not save the nation, who would? The spark in Samsun. In the early summer of 1919, as the empire's heart faltered, a lone ship departed from Constantinople. Aboard the vessel, the SS Bandırma, was a man whose journey would alter the course of his nation forever. His name was Mustafa Kemal Pasha, a decorated soldier, the hero of Gallipoli, and a man of sharp eyes and quiet conviction. The Sultan had sent him east, officially to oversee the disbanding of Ottoman troops in Anatolia. But Mustafa Kemal carried with him a different mission, one unspoken and one far greater. When his ship touched the shores of Samsun on May 19, 1919, a new chapter in Turkish history began. Around him lay a wounded land, villages burned, soldiers unpaid, people starving under the humiliation of foreign flags. Yet in that despair, he saw not defeat, but opportunity. Under the watchful eyes of British officials and loyalist spies, Kemal began to move carefully. He reached out to local commanders, rallying them in secret meetings. His words were simple but powerful. The war is not over. As weeks passed, small pockets of defiance turned into organized resistance. From the Black Sea towns to the central plains of Anatolia, whispers spread like wildfire. Mustafa Kemal is building an army. The Sultan's court grew anxious. Warnings came from British officers demanding Kemal's return to Constantinople. Even the Sultan himself sent orders for his arrest, but Kemal refused. He resigned from the Ottoman army, abandoning his title, his rank, and his imperial honors, and in doing so, severed his last tie to the dying empire. By the time he reached Amasya, the choice was was clear: there would be no going back. In meetings that followed, he and his companions laid the foundation for a new movement, one that no longer served the Sultan but the Turkish nation itself. In Erzurum and Sivas, congresses convened under his guidance. For the first time, representatives from across Anatolia declared their will to defend the homeland's integrity and independence. And from those halls of smoke and secrecy, the words of defiance became a promise. Turkey would live again. A nation divided by late 1919, the cracks in the Ottoman Empire had become canyons. Two governments now claimed to speak for Turkey, one in Istanbul, bound to the Allies and the Sultan, and the other in Ankara, loyal to the dream of freedom. To the Sultan, Mustafa Kemal and his followers were traitors, rebels challenging the divine order. To the people, they were patriots, the last defenders of Turkish honor. As foreign soldiers patrolled the streets of Constantinople, the Sultan's court grew desperate. He turned to loyalists and old war heroes to suppress the rebellion. Among them was Ahmet Anzavur, a Circassian leader once celebrated for his courage, now determined to crush the nationalist cause. Anzavur rallied royalist forces under the Sultan's banner, denouncing Kemal's men as heretics, unionists, and Freemasons. He called them tools of chaos who must be destroyed. Civil war began to flicker within the greater struggle for independence. While Turks fought Turks, the Allies watched and calculated. The British, weary of war but unwilling to lose control, shifted their focus to another ally, Greece. In their eyes, the Greek army could serve where they no longer wished to bleed. And so, with Allied blessing, Greek troops continued their expansion across western Anatolia, pressing deeper toward the heart of Turkish resistance. From Smyrna to Eskişehir, Turkish villages burned, and the dream of peace grew faint. The Treaty of Sèvres, drafted by the Allies in 1920, promised to carve the Ottoman lands into pieces, leaving only a fragile, powerless shell behind. But instead of surrender, the treaty brought fury. The ink on its pages became a spark that united millions under one banner. In Ankara, the Grand National Assembly was born, a new parliament, a new heartbeat. Its message was clear and simple: sovereignty belongs unconditionally to the nation. In that moment, the Ottoman Empire and the Republic yet to come stared each other down across the plains of Anatolia, and the time for words was ending. Soon, the rifles would speak. The year was 1921, and the struggle for Turkey's soul had reached its breaking point. The Greeks, confident in their strength and backed by the Allies, marched deep into Anatolia. Their goal was bold and devastating: to crush the resistance at its heart and force the Turks to accept the Treaty of Sèvres, the blueprint for the empire's dismemberment. In the cold of January, the Greeks launched their first assault. The First Battle of İnönü erupted across the rolling hills of western Anatolia. It was a clash of armies, but also of identities, between an old order clinging to survival and a new nation fighting to be born. For 2 days, Turkish troops under İsmet Pasha held their ground, forcing the invaders to retreat. It was a small victory, but it echoed loudly. For the first time, the nationalists had stood their ground against a foreign army and won. Less than 2 months later, the Second Battle of İnönü began. The Greeks came again, stronger, more determined, but once more the Turkish lines held. The soldiers fought not for a sultan's decree, but for the soil beneath their feet, for the homes behind them, for the nation that was still being written into existence. Their endurance carried meaning far beyond the battlefield. In Ankara, the victory gave rise to the Constitution of 1921, a document proclaiming that sovereignty no longer belonged to kings or empires, but to the people themselves. It was more than law. It was a declaration of rebirth. Yet the war was far from over. The Greeks, furious at their defeats, prepared one final push. In the summer of 1921, their armies crossed the plains once more, advancing toward the Sakarya River, less than 100 miles from Ankara. For 22 endless days and nights, the two sides clashed under a burning Anatolian sun. The land itself became a furnace of dust and fire. Mustafa Kemal, now commander-in-chief, led from the front. He told his men, "There is no defense line, only a defense area, and that area is the whole nation." When the smoke finally cleared, the Greeks fell back in ruin. The battle had drained both sides, but for Turkey, it was a turning point. The tide had shifted. The invader could be beaten. and freedom was no longer a dream whispered in the dark. It was now within reach. By 1922, the land had endured years of fire. From the Black Sea to the Aegean, villages lay in ashes, and both armies were weary. Yet the Turkish people, hardened by hunger, grief, and hope, refused to bow. The victories at Inonu and Sakarya had proved their strength, but victory alone was not enough. To secure their homeland, they would need one final blow, a strike so decisive that no foreign power could ever again dictate their fate. Mustafa Kemal, now bearing the full weight of command, prepared for that moment with quiet determination. He reorganized his scattered forces into a single, disciplined army. Weapons were gathered from abandoned battlefields, horses from the countryside, uniforms stitched by the hands of villagers who had lost everything. Even as the Allies watched from afar, believing the Turks too exhausted to rise again, a storm was forming in the mountains of western Anatolia. On August 26, 1922, the silence broke. At dawn, the Turkish artillery thundered, the beginning of what would be called the Great Offensive. Across the ridges of Dumlupınar, the air filled with smoke and cries. Greek forces, stretched thin and demoralized, could not withstand the fury that fell upon them. For 4 relentless days, the Turkish army surged forward, breaking through line after line. Commanders who had once doubted the revolution now watched in awe as the enemy scattered. By September, the Greeks were in full retreat, their ranks collapsing, their hopes consumed by the fire they had once brought. Mustafa Kemal rode with his men through the liberated cities, the crescent flag rising again over each one. When his army reached Izmir, the war's last great echo faded into silence. The occupiers were gone, the homeland was free, but as the guns quieted, another kind of battle began, one of diplomacy, of recognition, of rebirth. For though the fighting was over, the world still had to accept that from the corpse of the Ottoman Empire, a new nation had risen, proud, defiant, and alive. The thunder of war had faded, but the echoes of empire still haunted the air. The Allies, stunned by the swiftness of the Turkish victory, now faced a truth they could not deny. The Ottoman Empire was dead, and a new power stood in its place. In October 1922, the guns fell silent with the signing of the Armistice of Mudanya. Greek troops withdrew from eastern Thrace, and foreign soldiers began to leave Turkish soil. In Constantinople, the last Sultan, Mehmed VI Vahideddin, watched helplessly as the foundations of his throne crumbled. By the end of the year, under quiet pressure from the revolutionaries, he fled the empire aboard a British ship, the final shadow of 6 centuries of Ottoman rule slipping into the sea. Diplomats gathered in Lausanne, Switzerland, to decide what would rise in its place. For 8 long months, Turkish representatives stood firm against the demands of the victors. At last, on July 24, 1923, the Treaty of Lausanne was signed, erasing the humiliation of Sèvres and recognizing for the first time the sovereignty of the Republic of Turkey. The war was over, the occupation ended, and the long dream of freedom had finally awakened. On October 29, 1923, Mustafa Kemal stood before the newly formed Grand National Assembly in Ankara and declared the birth of the Republic. The nation that had once been carved and divided now stood united under its own flag. The man who had led peasants, students, and soldiers through ruin and victory was now its first president, soon to be known as Ataturk, the father of the Turks. From the ashes of empire, a new identity emerged, modern, independent, and unshaken. The world had doubted that such a rebirth was possible, but Turkey had proven otherwise. It was not the might of an empire that gave it life again, but the will of its people, the fire of a nation that refused to die. And so, the story of the Turkish War of Independence came to its end, not with conquest, but with rebirth. This was how the dying embers of an empire gave rise to a nation. This was how defeat became destiny. This is Erahive, where history speaks.